Cops mock black woman in court, unaware she's the Homeland Security chief. A charged silence blanketed the courtroom as the defendant, a poised black woman, stepped forward. She was dressed impeccably in a sharp navy blue suit, her presence radiating an air of quiet authority. Meanwhile, two police officers seated at the prosecution's table exchanged smug glances, their expressions dripping with confidence. To them, this was just another easy win, another case where they could put someone in their place and walk away victorious. What they failed to realize, however, was that the woman standing before them was far from an ordinary defendant. What was about to unfold would leave the entire courtroom and the entire city completely stunned. Secrets long buried, prejudices left unspoken, and an impending reckoning loomed over the trial, thickening the air with tension. The balance of power was about to shift so drastically that no one in that room would walk away unaffected. The morning sunlight spilled through the towering windows of Marston County Courthouse, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floors. The corridors buzzed with the hushed murmurs of reporters, cameras flashing, notepads ready. To an outsider, this may have seemed like just another routine trial, but anyone who had been in the courtroom long enough could feel it, the unexplainable energy, the undercurrent of something monumental brewing beneath the surface. Spectators flooded the room, packing every available seat. Even the security guards at the entrance, usually indifferent to these proceedings, seemed unusually alert, as if they, too, sensed that what was about to unfold was far from ordinary. The tension was palpable. And at the heart of it all was Elise Morgan. A striking black woman in her 40s, she stood with the kind of confidence that spoke of experience, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of self. Her high cheekbones and sharp, knowing gaze revealed nothing, yet commanded respect. Unlike many high-profile defendants, she had no media frenzy surrounding her, no throngs of people clamoring for attention. Just her legal counsel, Gregory Holtz, a seasoned attorney known for his relentless pursuit of justice, and his assistant, who quietly observed from the background. Elise's movements were deliberate, precise, like someone who already knew the outcome of the battle before it had even begun. At the prosecution's table, Officers Ridley and Dave Thompson of the Westbridge Police Department sat with smug expressions. Ridley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exuding the confidence of a man who had never had his authority questioned. Beside him, Thompson, younger but just as arrogant, wore a smirk that barely contained his amusement. "This one's gonna be easy," Thompson muttered under his breath. Ridley let out a quiet chuckle. "It always is when they think they can outsmart us." From the judge's bench, Judge Pamela Whitfield, her black robe draped over her shoulders like the weight of the law itself, adjusted her glasses and leafed through a stack of files. The only sounds in the room were the quiet rustling of papers and the occasional shuffling of court staff. Though Judge Whitfield's expression remained unreadable, there was something in her gaze that suggested she, too, sensed that today's trial would be anything but routine. Elise Morgan had been charged with obstruction of a police investigation. According to official reports, she had interfered with an active police operation conducted by Ridley and Thompson. The encounter had quickly escalated, resulting in her arrest. Yet, the details of the incident had been deliberately kept vague. But as Elise took her seat at the defendant's table, hands folded neatly before her, it became clear there was far more to this case than what had been presented to the public. Her posture was calm, composed, but to those who paid close attention, there was the slightest tension in her jaw, the only sign that she took this trial with the utmost seriousness. Yet, there was no fear in her eyes, no desperation. And today, the city of Westbridge was about to learn why. None of them, not the jury, not the prosecution, and certainly not the arrogant officers at the prosecution's table, were prepared for what was about to be revealed. As the bailiff finally called the court to order, the world inside that courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was it. The trial had begun. And by the time it was over, the truth that would come to light would change everything. The room settled into an uneasy quiet as Judge Whitfield addressed the jury, a diverse but unreadable mix of men and women. Some looked indifferent, still shaking off their morning fatigue, while others leaned forward with curiosity, sensing that this was no ordinary case. Assistant District Attorney Colleen Marshall stood, her presence commanding attention. A veteran in the courtroom, she spoke with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to painting compelling narratives. Her opening statement depicted Elise Morgan as a reckless individual, someone who had deliberately interfered with law enforcement. Though her tone remained professional, there was a subtle condescension in her words, a quiet suggestion that Elise's actions had been impulsive rather than deliberate. Ridley and Thompson exchanged triumphant glances as Marshall emphasized their dedicated service to the city, spinning their narrative as one of good officers merely trying to do their jobs. Across the courtroom, Elise sat unmoved, her gaze flickering over the jury. She caught the subtle shifts in their postures, the slight pursing of lips, those tiny micro-expressions that revealed more than words ever could. She had spent enough years navigating high-stakes environments to know exactly what those shifts meant. Then Gregory Holt stood. Though age had carved deep lines into his face, his presence commanded every eye in the room. A legend in Westbridge's legal circles, he was a man who had built his career dismantling injustice piece by piece. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried across the room as he turned to face the jury. For days, you've only heard the prosecution's version of events. The media has fed you a narrative that paints Miss Morgan as an obstructionist, someone who interfered with a lawful investigation. He paused, letting the words settle. But I urge you, keep an open mind. He took a slow step forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the jury. Because what you're about to learn will force you to question everything officers Ridley and Thompson have claimed. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about a woman interfering with the police. He glanced briefly at Elise, who remained eerily calm. It's about who she is, and why these officers worked so hard to keep that hidden. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the officers, so smug just moments before, suddenly stiffened. Because the truth was about to come out, and none of them were ready for what was coming next. Cops mock black woman in court, unaware she's the Homeland Security Chief, Part 2. As soon as the words unlawful conduct and intimidation left Gregory Holtz's mouth, a noticeable shift occurred at the prosecution's table. Officers Ridley and Thompson, who had been sitting with smug confidence just moments before, suddenly tensed. Ridley's arrogant grin flickered, just for a split second, before he masked it with a sneer. Across from him, Thompson, who had been casually drumming his fingers against the table, hesitated for the first time. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, though he quickly tried to brush it off. The opening statements wrapped up, and Judge Whitfield declared a brief recess before the first witness would be called. It was a moment for everyone in the courtroom to catch their breath, though the tension in the air remained suffocating. At the prosecution's table, whispers filled the air as the legal team huddled at the side bench, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Ridley, clearly unsettled, shot Elise Morgan a derisive glance, his lips moving silently, likely forming an insult meant just for her. Beside him, Thompson merely smirked, exuding the same arrogance he always carried. Elise, however, didn't flinch. She sat with quiet composure, engaged in what seemed like a casual conversation with Gregory Holtz. To an untrained eye, she looked like any other well-dressed defendant consulting with her legal counsel. She even offered the occasional polite smile in response. But beneath the surface, her pulse hammered. Every time Ridley or Thompson muttered under their breath, her instincts flared, her adrenaline surged. It took every ounce of self-control not to stand up and expose the truth right then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she waited. She watched. She wanted to see just how far Ridley and Thompson would take their performance, just how deep they would dig themselves, before the inevitable moment when the truth would shatter their carefully constructed facade. In the hallway outside the courtroom, a handful of reporters gathered, their cameras flashing as Elise made her way toward the water fountain. She offered no comment, no reaction. Just a polite nod and a subtle raise of her hand, calm, controlled, unreadable. At her side, Tiana, her assistant, remained quietly vigilant. A sharp, observant young woman with an eye for detail, Tiana had been through enough high-pressure situations to sense when things were about to take a dramatic turn. She stayed close, ensuring the press didn't get too intrusive. Because Tiana knew. She knew exactly who Elise Morgan was. She knew that this trial wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about something bigger. It was about exposing a systemic pattern, a deeply ingrained corruption and racial bias that had plagued the Westbridge Police Department for years. This was bigger than Elise Morgan. This was about justice. And Elise was determined to make sure that justice was served. As the sound of Judge Whitfield's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of recess, the atmosphere tightened once again. The prosecution still sat with an air of confidence, as if they held every card in the deck. Elise inhaled deeply, her gaze locking onto Ridley and Thompson. They had no idea what was coming. Their reckoning was near, and soon, the entire courtroom, the entire city, would witness just how quickly arrogance and prejudice crumble in the face of undeniable truth. As the first witness prepared to be called, Gregory Holtz made a sudden request. Your Honor, before we proceed, the defense requests permission to present key evidence, surveillance footage from the day of Miss Morgan's arrest. Judge Whitfield narrowed her eyes, considering the request. After a brief pause, she nodded. Motion granted. A low murmur spread through the room as the courtroom lights dimmed. All eyes turned to the large screens mounted on the walls as the grainy black and white surveillance footage began to play. The video opened on a quiet residential street in Westbridge, late afternoon. The houses were modest but well-kept, and the street was lined with several police vehicles parked haphazardly along the curb. Officers moved about, some taking notes, others standing guard. Then the camera angle shifted. It captured Ridley and Thompson approaching a woman on the sidewalk, Elise Morgan. Dressed casually, Elise appeared to be returning from a community event when the officers confronted her. Though the footage had no audio, body language told the story loud and clear. Elise stood composed, but concerned, gesturing, likely asking the officers why they were in her neighborhood. Ridley and Thompson's exaggerated arm movements made them appear dismissive, perhaps even hostile. Then, Elise took a single step back, palms up, a universal sign of non-aggression. And in an instant, without warning, Thompson lunged. He yanked a pair of handcuffs from his belt and reached for Elise. Ridley loomed over her, his stance unmistakably threatening. A thick, heavy silence swallowed the courtroom. Elise remained outwardly calm, but her eyes flickered, a subtle but unmistakable shift. For many of the jurors, this was the first time they were seeing the truth for themselves. If Elise had truly been obstructing an investigation, if she had been interfering, this footage didn't show it. Instead, it showed something else entirely. It showed a woman being surrounded, cornered, restrained. The footage froze on the moment Elise was slammed against a police cruiser, her arms wrenched behind her back, her wrists locked in steel cuffs. Gregory's voice cut through the silence, steady, deliberate, unshakable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this footage is only the beginning. He turned, scanning their faces. Tell me, what do you see? A woman calmly asking questions? A woman stepping back, non-threatening, non-violent? And yet, within seconds, the situation escalates into force. The prosecution claims she was obstructing an operation, but is that what you see? Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Marshall cleared her throat, clearly preparing a counter-argument. But before she could speak, the lights came back on. And Gregory continued. We will present eyewitness testimony from residents who saw what really happened that day. A stir rippled through the room, including one neighbor who will confirm that Miss Morgan's only concern was for an elderly resident inside that home, a woman who had previously reported police harassment. A brief sidebar discussion followed, but Judge Whitfield ultimately granted the defense's request to proceed. And so, the first witness was called. Carmen Williams, a retired schoolteacher, a longtime neighborhood watch volunteer, and Most importantly, a woman who had seen it all firsthand. She had been out walking her dog when the arrest happened. And as she stepped forward, speaking with quiet but unwavering conviction, the truth, the real truth, was about to be laid bare. And for Ridley and Thompson, there would be nowhere left to hide.